January 17, 1945, Fort Devens, Massachusetts. The iron gate swung open under a pale winter sky, and the first column of German prisoners shuffled through the entrance with the slow, uncertain gait of men who had stopped believing in solid ground. Their boots, what remained of them, crunched against the frozen gravel. The cold was different here, not the biting, merciless cold of the Eastern Front, nor the damp chill of the Ardennes where so many of them had been captured only weeks before. This was a clean cold, the kind that comes with clear skies and the promise of shelter. The wind carried the scent of wood smoke and something else, something they couldn't immediately place, the rich, fatty aroma of cooking food, real food. Not the watery turnip soup they'd subsisted on for months, not the sawdust bread that had become standard issue in the Wehrmacht by late 1944, but something substantial, something that made their hollow stomachs clench with a pain that was half memory, half hope. They were led into a mess hall, a long wooden structure heated by cast-iron stoves. The warmth hit them like a physical force, and several men swayed on their feet. They'd grown accustomed to cold. Cold was normal, cold was expected. Warmth was suspicious. Inside, American soldiers in clean uniforms directed them to tables, their expressions neither hostile nor friendly, simply efficient. The prisoners sat, silent, exchanging glances that asked the same question without words. What happens now? Then the trays came. Not tin plates with portions measured out by the gram, not the meager rations they divided among themselves in frozen foxholes, but actual trays loaded with food. Mashed potatoes, genuine potatoes that hadn't been stretched with chestnuts or beet pulp, sliced meat that looked and smelled like meat, bread, white bread, soft and fresh, vegetables. And there on each tray, sitting in a small paper cup as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, was a portion of butter. Yellow, creamy, impossibly pure butter. A young *Jeffrader from Munich, 22 years old and looking 50, stared at the butter for nearly a full minute. His hand trembled as he reached for it, as if it might vanish, as if he might wake up back in the ruins of his bunker near Bastogne. He touched it with one finger, feeling the give of it, the reality of it. Then he did something he hadn't done in 4 years of war. He wept. Silently, without sound, tears simply running down his hollow cheeks while his fellow prisoners pretended not to notice because they understood, because several of them were doing the same thing. This is the story of what happened when the ideology met abundance, when the soldiers of the Third Reich, raised on speeches about racial superiority and German destiny, fed on promises of Lebensraum and conquest, encountered the staggering, incomprehensible wealth of the nation they'd been taught to despise. This is the story of butter. To understand the shock of that moment, one must first understand the Germany they came from. The Germany of 1945 was a nation consuming itself. Food rations had been declining since 1942, cut and cut again, until they existed more as theoretical allocations than actual meals. By late 1944, the official ration for a normal adult German civilian was 1,990 calories per day, and even that was rarely met. Frontline soldiers were supposed to receive more, but supply lines were collapsing, and what was supposed to arrive often didn't. The Frontillage asterisk, the extra ration for combat troops, had become a bitter joke. Men fought on turnip soup and black bread, so adulterated with sawdust and potato starch, that it caused digestive ailments even as it failed to provide nutrition. Butter had disappeared from German tables years before. In its place came Kunstfett asterisk, artificial fat made from coal tar derivatives, a gray-white substance that tasted of chemicals and sat in the stomach like clay. The official ration was 25 grams per week, barely more than a tablespoon, and even that was often unavailable. German soldiers at the front made do with hardened lard when they had anything at all. They spread it on bread if bread existed, or ate it straight from the tin, forcing it down because it was calories, because calories meant another day of survival. The propaganda had prepared them for hardship. Dr. Goebbels himself had declared that the German people would endure any sacrifice for final victory. That strength came from suffering, that the soft, decadent democracies would collapse under pressure, while German will held firm. The soldiers had believed it because belief was easier than doubt, because doubt led to the scaffold or the concentration camp. They'd been told that America was a nation of mongrels and degenerates, rich in resources but poor in spirit, that American soldiers were coddled. The prisoners at Fort Devens in January 1945 were among the first large groups captured during the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate gamble in the Ardennes. They'd gone into that offensive half-starved already, their fuel tanks running on fumes, their supply trucks empty. They'd been promised that captured American supplies would sustain the offensive, and in the first days, that had actually worked. German soldiers overrunning American positions found themselves almost paralyzed by the abundance. Warehouses full of rations, cases of cigarettes, chocolate bars by the thousands, gasoline and ammunition stacked to the rafters. One Obergefreiter wrote in a letter home, a letter later captured and translated by Allied intelligence, that he'd eaten more in 2 days of looting American depots than in the previous 2 weeks of regular rations. But the offensive failed, the supplies ran out, and the capture came swift and brutal. Cold, hungry, exhausted, the survivors surrendered or were rounded up in the forests and brought back in long columns through Luxembourg and Belgium to the coast, then loaded onto ships bound for America. They expected execution or slavery. The Geneva Convention was something they'd heard about but didn't quite believe in. The SS had told them stories about what happened to German prisoners, stories designed to make them fight to the death. So when the ship pulled into Boston Harbor and they were marched off under guard but without violence, it was the first surprise. When they were given blankets and medical examinations, it was the second. When they entered that mess hall and saw the trays of food, it was the third, and the one that broke something fundamental in their understanding of the world. The butter became symbolic almost immediately. Not because it was the most plentiful thing. There was far more bread, more potatoes, more meat, but because it represented something beyond mere nutrition. Butter was a luxury, a marker of prosperity. Even in peacetime Germany, even during the relatively prosperous 1930s after the worst of the Depression had passed, butter had been expensive, something used sparingly, saved for special occasions. German housewives had learned a dozen ways to stretch butter, to make a little go a long way. And now here it was, given daily to prisoners, to defeated enemies, as if it were nothing. The daily ration for a prisoner of war in American camps was set by the Geneva Convention at parity with American troops. 4,000 calories per day for men engaged in labor, 3,500 for those who were not. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, with characteristic American efficiency, calculated this down to the gram and made sure it was delivered. Breakfast might include eggs, bacon, toast, butter, jam, coffee with real milk and real sugar. Lunch brought meat, vegetables, bread, and fruit. Dinner repeated the pattern with variations. The prisoners gained weight. The photographs tell the story. Gaunt, hollow-eyed men arriving in the winter of 1945, and the same men 6 months later healthy, filled out, looking more like soldiers and less like walking skeletons. One prisoner, a former Hauptmann named Ernst Krieger, kept a secret diary during his internment at Camp Comoe in Mississippi. He wrote in tiny script on scraps of paper, hiding them in his mattress, an old habit from the front where writing anything unauthorized could bring punishment. His entries from early 1945 record his astonishment in plain, almost disbelieving language. February 3rd. They gave us butter again today. Butter. I watched the Americans in the guardhouse eating their lunch. They had the same food we did, perhaps even less meat, but the butter was the same. They spread it thick on their bread and thought nothing of it. I wanted to shout at them. Do you know what you have? Do you understand that men are dying for this? A week later, February 10th, I am gaining weight. My uniform, which hung on me like a scarecrow's rags, is beginning to fit again. My hands no longer shake. I can think clearly for the first time in months. Is this what defeat feels like? If so, why were we fighting? That question, asterisk why were we fighting, echoed through the camps. It was asked in whispers, in careful conversations, in the silence that fell when the American guards weren't watching and men could speak freely. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. They had been told for 12 years that the Reich represented the pinnacle of civilization, that the Führer was leading them to glory, that sacrifice now meant abundance later. They had endured the sacrifice. They had given up butter, given up meat, given up coffee and sugar and everything else, all for the promise of eventual victory and the Lebensraum that would make Germany prosperous forever. And here in the land of the enemy, in the nation they'd been told was decadent and doomed, there was butter every day. Not just for the rich, not just for the powerful, but for prisoners, for the defeated, for them. The American guards found the German obsession with butter puzzling at first, then amusing, then finally somewhat touching. One sergeant from Iowa, a farmer's son who'd grown up churning butter by hand, tried to explain but didn't really believe him. It seemed impossible. Germany was an advanced industrial nation, a European power with colonies and resources, and Germany couldn't produce enough butter. How could this crude, sprawling nation across the ocean manage what the Reich could not? The answer lay in systems they didn't understand and couldn't see. The American agricultural system in 1945 was a vast, humming engine of productivity that had only accelerated during the war. Mechanization, electrification, scientific farming, hybrid seeds, synthetic fertilizers, all of it working together to produce surpluses that seemed almost obscene to European eyes. The United States was feeding itself, feeding Britain, feeding the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, feeding its own military forces scattered across the globe, and still producing enough to give butter to German prisoners of war. But it wasn't just the food. The prisoners worked. The Geneva Convention required it, and they were assigned to non-military labor, and they saw American industry from the inside. They cut timber in Oregon and picked cotton in Texas and harvested wheat in Kansas, and everywhere they went, they saw abundance. They saw machines doing the work of hundreds of men. They saw waste on a scale that shocked them. Equipment that would have been carefully maintained and repaired in Germany simply discarded and replaced because new was cheaper than fixed. They saw workers, ordinary American workers, not industrialists or officers but common laborers, driving automobiles to their jobs, eating restaurant meals, living in houses with electricity and indoor plumbing. A group of prisoners assigned to a farm in Pennsylvania watched the farmer's wife make breakfast one morning. She used butter without measuring, simply cutting off a chunk and dropping it in the pan to fry eggs. She used 4 eggs for 3 people. She poured milk for the children without checking how much was left in the bottle because there was always more in the refrigerator, and the milk truck came twice a week. The prisoners, watching through the window while waiting for their work detail to begin, saw this casual abundance and felt something crack inside. One of them, a veteran of Stalingrad, said later that Stalingrad hadn't broken him, but that breakfast did. The ideological preparation of the Wehrmacht had been thorough. The soldiers had been taught that democracy was weak, that it made nations soft and vulnerable. They'd been taught that racial hierarchy was natural law, that the Germans were destined to rule because they were superior. They'd been taught that Jews and Bolsheviks and capitalists were conspiring to destroy Germany, and that only the Führer stood between the Volk and annihilation. These weren't casual beliefs. They'd been reinforced through schools, through Hitler Youth, through every newspaper and radio broadcast for over a decade. But ideology crumbles against experience. The prisoners could rationalize some things. They could tell themselves that American military success was due to numbers, not quality, to industrial capacity rather than fighting spirit. They could maintain that Germans were better soldiers even in defeat, and in some technical senses, this was even true. But they couldn't rationalize the butter. They couldn't explain away the food, the medical care, the fact that they were treated in accordance with international law by guards who seemed neither particularly cruel nor particularly interested in revenge. Some held out. There were hardcore Nazis in every camp, men who remained loyal to Hitler even after his death, who explained away every contradiction and maintained their faith. They said the abundance was a trick, that it was propaganda, that America was showing them a false face and the reality was different. But their voices grew quieter as the months passed, because every day brought the same evidence. Butter, bread, meat, coffee. Every day, the same reality that contradicted everything they'd been promised. The American authorities, for their part, weren't consciously trying to deprogram their prisoners, though some officers recognized what was happening. The military government had psychologists who studied the prisoners, looking for intelligence and evaluating security risks, and these psychologists noted the transformation. They documented how prisoners who arrived as committed Nazis softened and changed when treated decently and fed adequately. It was an unplanned experiment in deprogramming, and it was remarkably effective. Letters home, heavily censored but allowed, began to carry dangerous truths. Prisoners told their families in Germany, still suffering under Allied bombing and food shortages, that they were eating better in captivity than they had in years. These letters were intercepted by German military intelligence, and they caused panic. The regime had always feared that knowledge of conditions in the West would undermine morale, and here was proof. Some prisoners who wrote too enthusiastically about their treatment found that their letters were never delivered, or that their families stopped writing back, often because the families had been visited by the Gestapo and warned. But the war was ending anyway. By spring 1945, it was over in Europe, and the prisoners could stop pretending they expected to return to a victorious Reich. They knew they'd been defeated, and they could acknowledge it, and with that acknowledgement came a kind of freedom to think thoughts that had been treasonous only months before. The butter became a talisman, a shorthand for everything they'd learned. In conversations among themselves, in the memoirs some of them wrote years later, the butter reappears again and again. It represented the fundamental lie they'd been told. That deprivation was strength, that suffering was noble, that the Allies were weak. The butter said otherwise. The butter said that a system that could produce abundance for everyone, even for prisoners, even for enemies, was stronger than any system built on hierarchy and suffering. Some of them came to political conclusions from this. They returned to Germany. Repatriation began in 1946 and continued into 1947, and became social democrats, or trade unionists, or simply ordinary citizens who remembered and refused to follow demagogues again. Others drew no such conclusions, remembered the food but not the lesson, went back to their lives and tried to forget the war entirely. Human beings are variable. There's no single story. But there was one thing nearly all of them agreed on, documented in interviews conducted decades later, in oral histories and memoirs. They had been shocked by the butter. It had been a small thing, a daily thing, something the Americans barely noticed. And it had done more to undermine their faith in the Reich than any propaganda leaflet, any re-education program, any speech about democracy could have done. Because the butter was real. The butter was there on the tray, every morning, solid and yellow, and tasting exactly like the butter they remembered from childhood, from the time before the war, before the shortages, before everything went wrong. It was a connection to the past and a glimpse of a possible future, one where there was enough, where people didn't have to fight for Lebensraum because there was room enough already, food enough, resources enough, if only they were distributed differently. The American system wasn't perfect. The prisoners understood that much even in captivity. They saw segregation in the camps, black soldiers and white soldiers separated, black prisoners of war held apart. Some prisoners, particularly those captured in North Africa, had been African colonial troops serving with the French, and they were treated worse than the Germans. The hypocrisy was visible. But so was the abundance, and the abundance was undeniable. There's a symbolic power to butter that goes beyond nutrition. Butter is what you have when you have enough. It's what comes after the milk is taken care of, after the immediate needs are met, when there's surplus to transform into something richer. Margarine is necessity. Butter is prosperity. Germany had developed margarine in the 19th century precisely because butter was expensive and scarce. The prisoners knew this history. They'd grown up on margarine, the cheap substitute, and they'd called it butter anyway because real butter was for special occasions. And now, every day was a special occasion, at least by the standards of their previous lives. By the summer of 1945, the camps had settled into routine. Work during the day, adequate food, medical care, educational programs for those who wanted them. Some prisoners learned English. Some took correspondence courses. Some simply existed, grateful to be alive and waiting to go home. The American authorities allowed them to stage plays and form orchestras, to publish camp newspapers, to have a semi-normal life within the confines of the barbed wire. And every morning, breakfast included butter. The symbolism wasn't lost on the American officers who ran the camps. Some of them, the more thoughtful ones, recognized that they were demonstrating something important. That democracy, for all its flaws and compromises, could produce material abundance that totalitarianism could not. It wasn't a message they consciously crafted, but it was a message delivered nonetheless, 3 times a day with every meal. One camp commander in Texas, a colonel who'd been a schoolteacher before the war, put it plainly in a letter to his wife. "We're winning the peace with roast beef and butter. These men arrived hating us, and they'll leave not quite understanding us, but they'll never forget that we fed them when their own government couldn't. That's worth more than a dozen speeches about freedom." He was right. The prisoners returned to Germany carrying memories of full plates and fair treatment. They returned to a devastated country, cities in ruins, the economy shattered, food still scarce. Though the Allies were working to fix that, establishing distribution systems, preventing mass starvation. Some of the returning prisoners became leaders in rebuilding their communities. They'd seen how there's a particular poignancy to the epilogue of this story. In the 1950s, during West Germany's economic miracle, butter returned to German tables. Production recovered. The economy rebuilt itself with Marshall Plan aid and German industriousness, and butter became ordinary again. Former prisoners, now middle-aged men with families and jobs, spread butter on their children's breakfast bread and remembered. Some of them told their children stories about the war, though many didn't. The war was something to forget, not to dwell on. But in private moments, in the quiet of their own thoughts, they remembered the first time they saw butter in that American mess hall, the first time they believed that perhaps they wouldn't starve, that perhaps the world wasn't as they'd been told. They remembered the taste of it, the richness that their shrunken stomachs could barely handle at first, the way it melted on warm bread. Ernst Krieger, the Hauptmann, who kept the secret diary, survived the war and became a journalist in Stuttgart. In 1982, near the end of his life, he wrote an article for a regional newspaper about his time as a prisoner of war. He described the camps, the work, the strange experience of being enemy and guest simultaneously. And he wrote about the butter. "We thought we were the master race, destined to rule. We thought our enemies were weak and decadent. Then they defeated us and fed us butter every day, and we learned that we'd been wrong about everything. The butter didn't make me love America. That would be too simple. But it made me question Germany, question the men who'd led us into the abyss while promising greatness. It made me wonder what kind of system could give its prisoners better food than we'd given our soldiers. That question shaped the rest of my life. This is the paradox of power. True strength doesn't need to announce itself. The Reich had held rallies and parades, had built monuments and proclaimed its greatness in every speech. America simply made butter and gave it away, even to enemies, because there was enough. The prisoners understood, in a way that transcended politics or ideology, that genuine abundance is quiet, that it shows itself in small things, daily things, things so ordinary that those who have them barely notice. The butter was a rebuke to everything they'd been taught. It was evidence that the world worked differently than the propaganda had claimed. And for men who'd built their identities on those claims, who'd fought and killed for them, the evidence was devastating and liberating in equal measure. On a spring morning in 1946, the last large group of German prisoners departed from Camp Ruston in Louisiana, bound for the port at Norfolk, and then home. They'd spent more than a year in captivity, working in the pine forests and cotton fields, eating regular meals, sleeping in heated barracks, receiving letters from home when the mail got through. They lined up for a final breakfast before boarding the trucks that would take them to the train station. The mess sergeant, following the same routine he'd followed for a year, laid out butter with the bread. One of the prisoners, a young man from Hamburg who'd been captured near Aachen in October 1944, picked up his portion of butter and held it for a moment, turning it over in his hand. He'd arrived at this camp weighing 112 pounds, skeletal and sick. He was leaving at 165 pounds, healthy, ready to face whatever came next. The butter in his hand represented everything he'd learned and everything he was leaving behind. He spread it on his bread, ate it slowly, and tried to remember that this, too, was just an ordinary thing, something that should be ordinary, something that could be ordinary if the world were built differently. Then he boarded the truck and the truck drove away, and the war continued its slow fade into history. But the memory of butter remained. It remained in the stories told quietly, in the lessons learned but not always spoken. It remained in the reconstruction of Germany, in the social market economy that emerged from the ruins, in the determination not to repeat the mistakes. It remained in the way these men, when they became voters and citizens and fathers, made different choices than their fathers had made. Not all of them, not even most of them perhaps, but enough. Enough to matter. Because in the end, the great ideological struggle of the 20th century wasn't won primarily through battles or bombs, though those were necessary. It was won through the quiet, persistent demonstration that one system could provide for its people, could provide even for its enemies, in ways that the other could not. The butter was a symbol, but symbols matter. They stick in memory when speeches fade. They provide reference points, moments of clarity that illuminate larger truths. The truth that the German prisoners learned, sitting in American camps and eating butter every day, was that abundance is possible, that it doesn't require conquest or Lebensraum or racial hierarchy. It requires organization, yes, and resources and work, but it's possible. The world contains enough if the systems are right, if the distribution is fair, if the goal is sufficiency for all rather than supremacy for some. That truth, learned one breakfast at a time, one portion of butter at a time, did as much to ensure that Europe wouldn't turn toward fascism again as any treaty or occupation. It was soft power in the most literal sense, the power of showing rather than telling, of demonstrating through action what kind of society was possible. And so the story of German prisoners and their daily butter becomes not just a curious footnote of World War II, but a parable about power and ideology, about what breaks belief and what builds it. The Reich promised glory and delivered starvation. America promised nothing and delivered breakfast. The prisoners, choosing between the promise and the breakfast, chose breakfast. And in choosing, they chose a different future, not just for themselves but for the nations they would help rebuild. The butter itself was unremarkable, just dairy fat, salted and churned, packaged in small portions for institutional use. But in the context of that time and that place, given to those men in that condition, it became something more. It became proof that the grand ideological narratives they'd been fed were lies, that the simple material facts of who could provide and who couldn't mattered more than any racial theory or nationalist mythology. This is what history often looks like at human scale. Not great battles and famous speeches, but small moments of recognition, ordinary things made extraordinary by context. A man sits in a prison camp in Mississippi, eats butter on his bread, and feels the foundation of his worldview crack. He doesn't become an American. He doesn't abandon his Germanness or his identity. But he abandons something else, the certainty that he and his nation were right, that their suffering had meaning, that their enemies were inferior. That abandonment, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of prisoners, carried back to a devastated Germany and planted in the rubble, grew into something new. Not perfect, nothing human is perfect, but different, better, wiser. The butter itself is gone, eaten 70 years ago and forgotten by everyone except those who needed it and couldn't believe it was real. But what it represented, what it taught, echoes forward into the present. It echoes in the European Union, in NATO, in the long peace that has held since 1945 in places where war was once constant. It echoes in the choices made by generations who learned, one way or another, that systems which produce butter for prisoners are stronger than systems which produce only promises and pain. And in the end, that's the story worth remembering. Not just that German prisoners ate butter in American camps, but what that butter meant, what it revealed, and what it changed. In the great symbolic architecture of World War II, amid all the horror and heroism, the butter stands as evidence that sometimes the most powerful victories are the quietest ones, one not with weapons, but with the simple, radical act of giving people enough. Enough to eat, enough to live, enough to reconsider everything they'd been told,